Hey guys, welcome back to the YouTube channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at the iPhone 14 Pro to see how it's held up after almost a year of use. I'm going to be giving my take on the different features of the phone, the battery health, and at the end I'm going to answer whether this thing is worth buying, both new or refurbished, given that we are expecting the iPhone 15 series to be launched later next month. So if we take a look at the design of this thing, you can see that the outside has held up pretty well. I've been using this leather case from Apple, which has gotten most of the damage to be fair, but there have been many periods where I used the phone completely naked and you can see that there aren't any discernible marks or imperfections on this thing, which is really good. As always from Apple, they've nailed the aesthetics. I think Apple just has this way of making their products feel like jewelry. You know, you've got this frosted glass in the back, the stainless steel bands, and yeah, it's just a joy to look at. Now, a big issue I have had is with the screen. I don't know if Apple used a weaker glass material for their screens this year, but compared to my old iPhone 10, this thing has gotten so many more scratches. Whereas I think my iPhone 10 had just one mark after 5 years of use. So yeah, it's quite disappointing. I know some people will say that, well, you should just use a screen protector. However, I'm not a huge fan of screen protectors. I think they just make the phone look a lot less clean. And Apple even advertises this as a phone that you can use caseless and without a screen protector. But yeah, otherwise the design's been alright. I will say that compared to the iPhone 10, I do miss the round edges, especially when you're using this thing caseless. It can be quite harsh on the hands with these square corners. But, you know, aesthetically, these stainless steel bands, they do look gorgeous. They're just not that very comfortable to hold. And the final thing is the colour. So historically, I've always been a space grey guy, but I thought this time I'd go with the silver colour just to give it a go. And yeah, I think I can say that I'm never going silver again. It's not that this colour is bad, it's just I really miss how pro and premium the space grey colour felt. So for the reason I got silver was because I noticed that when it comes to the bezels, they actually look slimmer on silver iPhone models. And this is something I actually discovered from Mr. Who's the Boss, where he mentioned that because the outside band here is silver, it contrasts with the iPhone's actual bezels, which are black, whereas on the space black version, the banners themselves are black, so they almost merge with the screen and give the illusion of having larger bezels. So not a huge issue. Personally this year though, when I upgrade to the iPhone 15, I'm going to go back to space black. That's not to say silver is a bad colour inherently, it's just personally not for me. Now, moving on to performance, I'm going to keep this bit real short because there's not really much to say here. Yeah, it's got an A16 chip, which is just a slightly more refined version of the A15. The TLDR is it works just fine. You know, most apps, they open super fast. Yeah, I've never had any performance issues with this phone, which isn't saying much in 2023, but yeah, if you buy this thing, it'll work just fine. Now, where things get more interesting is with the display, because probably the biggest updates made to the iPhone 14 Pro last year were with the display. So we've got three things. There's 2000 nits of peak brightness, the dynamic island, and the always on display. Now, I absolutely love the new brighter display. It goes up to 2000 nits of peak brightness. I think Apple advertises it as a Super Retina XDR display, whatever that means. And it essentially makes using your iPhone in the sun so much easier, to the point where I could be wearing a pair of thick sunglasses on a hot day and I'd have no trouble seeing what's on my screen. Also, just a note guys, to enable the max 2000 nits of brightness, you do need to enable auto brightness on your settings. If you try manually increasing the brightness in Control Center, it'll likely max out at 1000 nits of brightness for standard use or 1600 for HDR like previous iPhone models, so do bear that in mind. Now onto the dynamic island, which was probably the most talked about feature at the iPhone event last year. To be honest, I have mixed feelings about this. Objectively speaking, this thing isn't really that useful. Like, sure, you can play and pause music here and you've got access to your controls, but you can do this anyway in Control Center in just as many steps. However, having said that, I really do like the feature. I think it just makes using the iPhone a bit more fun. Maybe it's a novelty thing that'll wear off over time. But yeah, I really like the feature. It just makes using the iPhone a lot more enjoyable. And finally, we have the always on display, which I actually really like. I think it's nice to be able to view your widgets at a glance. You know, like if you want to take a look at your reminders or your calendar to see what's on your schedule, or just to see the time when you're working. I think what would be really nice, however, is if we could actually get the always on display on the iPad, because oftentimes when I'm working on my desk, I'll have the iPad on the side as a second display. So it'd be kind of nice if we could have that always on feature in the future, but maybe Apple will do that, maybe they won't, maybe there are some design limitations, who knows. But yeah, I like the always on display. One thing to note is that this thing will drain your battery life a bit, probably not by much. I think most of the tests which people have done have found that you're probably going to be losing 5 to 10% of your battery life per day if you've got the always on display toggled on. But yeah, it's something to bear in mind. Now, moving on to the camera, if I'm being totally honest, I haven't really made use of the new 48 megapixel sensor. Maybe that's because I'm not the intended audience for this. I'm not a professional photographer, so I've taken a few shots with it, but then I realised how much room the photos took, so I just reverted back to using the normal camera. And I think for me, where the iPhone is still really lacking is in the selfie camera, especially when you're trying to take selfies at nighttime or in low lighting. I find that if you use something like the Samsung S23 Ultra, it does a much better job at capturing low light than the iPhone. So if I were Apple, I'd focus more on fixing that as opposed to trying to refine the front camera that's already pretty good for most people. Now, on to the final issue, and this is where the iPhone 14 Pro really struggles, and that's with battery. Apple says you can, in theory, get something like 23 hours of video playback or 28 hours of audio. I don't know, personally, I don't care. If I think about my day-to-day usage, it's been pretty poor. I've often had to find myself reaching for my charger midway through the day because this thing runs out of charge pretty quickly. I mean, if you take a look now, it's, just hit the afternoon and I'm already on 23%. And I started with 100% battery life in the morning. So that's pretty poor. It's not as bad as the iPhones from a few years ago, but if you are upgrading from, an iPhone 12 Pro or especially a 13 Pro, yeah, you're gonna see a bit of a letdown. If I was to guess why this has been the case, I'd imagine it's because Apple's used a smaller battery compared to the 13 Pro lineup. And, features like the 2000 nits display and the always-on display are just draining the battery life in the background. And the A16 chip probably just wasn't enough of an efficiency upgrade to offset these features. But yeah, because of that, I've now had to start carrying around this Banks MagSafe battery pack, which I've actually reviewed on this channel if you want to have a take a look. And if I look at the battery health, you can see that we're on 92%, which is pretty terrible for just 1 year of use. And I can imagine that in a year or two, the battery on this phone is going to be pretty poor, which is a shame because on the whole, this is a pretty good phone. It's got a premium looking design. It's obviously got iOS, one of the best OSs in the world. It's got features like the dynamic island, an excellent camera, but one of the most important features, which is the battery life, is severely lacking. And yeah, I think it's a bit of a shame. I'm hoping Apple will fix that with the iPhone 15s. So to wrap things up, should you consider buying an iPhone 14 Pro in 2023? Obviously, don't go for a new iPhone when the iPhone 15s are just around the corner, but should you get a refurbished one if you can find it on resale anywhere? And I think the answer is no, you shouldn't. I think just wait for the iPhone 15 Pros for when they come out, or buy a refurbished iPhone 13 Pro if you're someone who really cares about pricing, because it probably will have better battery life than the iPhone 14 Pro, and the 14 Pro, sure, it does have a better display and camera, but all of that is meaningless if you can't get through a full day of use with it. So that wraps up the video. Do let me know your thoughts about the iPhone 14 Pro in the comments down below. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.